When we talk about a worst case scenario in the Middle East, we're not just imagining more conflict. We're imagining a breakdown of the system that has, until now, prevented that conflict from spiraling completely out of control. And at the center of that system is deterrence. Deterrence is a simple idea in theory, the belief that the costs of an action will outweigh the benefits. But in practice, it's a delicate balance built on perception, communication, and credibility. It only works as long as all parties believe that escalation will lead to unacceptable consequences. The moment that belief is shaken, the entire structure begins to weaken. Now, imagine a scenario where that belief breaks down. Not gradually, not subtly, but decisively. A single event, whether it's a miscalculation, a targeted strike, or an unintended escalation, crosses a threshold. And in that moment, the calculation changes for every actor involved. Because deterrence is not just about capability, it's about confidence. Confidence that your opponent will restrain themselves. Confidence that escalation can be controlled. Confidence that red lines will be respected. When that confidence disappears, the system becomes unstable. And instability in a region as complex as the Middle East tends to spread quickly. What follows is not a linear escalation, it is a cascading one. Once deterrence is compromised, actors begin to act more aggressively, not necessarily because they want war, but because they fear being caught at a disadvantage if they don't act first. This is the classic security dilemma. Each side believes it is acting defensively while the other interprets those actions as offensive, and that misinterpretation becomes fuel for further escalation. So you begin to see a shift, not just in actions, but in mindset. Caution gives way to urgency. Restraint gives way to preemption. And the focus moves from avoiding conflict to shaping it on the most favorable terms possible. But in a region like the Middle East, the situation is rarely confined to just two actors. There are multiple states, multiple alliances, and multiple fault lines. That means when deterrence breaks in one place, it doesn't stay there. It reverberates. You might see rapid involvement from neighboring states, either directly or indirectly. Some may feel compelled to support their allies. Others may act to protect their own interests, and still others may intervene to prevent the situation from spiraling further. But in doing so, they may unintentionally accelerate that very spiral. This is where escalation becomes truly dangerous. Because once multiple actors are engaged, the conflict is no longer governed by a single set of calculations, where it becomes a network of interactions, each one influencing the others. And in that network, small actions can have disproportionately large consequences. There is also a psychological dimension to this breakdown that we cannot ignore. When deterrence fails, it creates a sense of unpredictability. And unpredictability is one of the most destabilizing forces in international relations. Because if you cannot predict your opponent's behavior, you have to prepare for a wider range of possibilities. And that in turn increases the likelihood of preemptive action. Not necessarily because actors want escalation, but because they want to avoid being caught off guard by it. So what you end up with is a feedback loop. Fear leads to action. Action leads to reaction. Reaction reinforces fear. And the cycle continues, often accelerating faster than policymakers can control. At the same time, communication becomes more difficult. Channels that were once used to de-escalate tensions may become strained or even cut off entirely. And when communication breaks down, the risk of miscalculation increases significantly. Because in the absence of clear signals, assumptions fill the gap, and assumptions in high-stakes environments can be dangerous. There is also a critical shift in how objectives are perceived. What may have started as a limited or strategic goal can evolve into something much broader. Retaliation can escalate into punishment, containment can shift into dominance, and the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes to return to the original framework. This is what makes a full regional breakdown so concerning. It is not just the intensity of the conflict, it is the loss of control over its trajectory. Once that control is lost, even partially, the system becomes much harder to stabilize, Mike. And here is the deeper strategic truth. Deterrence doesn't fail because actors suddenly become irrational. It fails because the assumptions underlying it no longer hold, because the signals are misread, because the costs are underestimated, or because the stakes become too high for restraint to feel safe. So, when we talk about the collapse of deterrence, we are really talking about a shift in perception, a shift in how actors evaluate risk, respond to threats, and interpret each other's intentions. And once that shift happens, everything changes, because deterrence is not just a military concept. It is the invisible framework that keeps conflict from becoming uncontrollable. And when that framework breaks, the consequences don't unfold slowly. They unfold quickly. And often they unfold in ways that no one intended. If deterrence collapses, the next phase is almost inevitable, the activation of proxy networks and a surge in asymmetric warfare. And this is where the conflict becomes not just more intense, but far more difficult to control. Because unlike conventional warfare, where actors are clearly defined and engagements are relatively structured, asymmetric warfare operates in a far more fluid and ambiguous space. It doesn't rely on symmetry. It relies on adaptability. It thrives on complexity. And most importantly, it spreads across networks rather than remaining confined to front lines. In the Middle East, these proxy networks are not theoretical. They are deeply embedded in the political and security architecture of the region. They include non-state armed groups, militias, political movements with military wings, and loosely coordinated networks that can be activated when conditions demand it. And when a larger conflict escalates, these groups often become key participants, not just as supporting actors, but as independent drivers of the conflict itself. Now, here's the critical point. Proxies don't operate with the same constraints as states. They are not bound by the same diplomatic pressures. They are often more ideologically driven, more decentralized, and less constrained by concerns like international legitimacy or economic stability. That gives them a certain kind of strategic freedom, but it also makes their actions harder to predict and even harder to control. So when a regional war begins to escalate, these actors can quickly become force multipliers. They expand the geographic scope of the conflict. They introduce new fronts, and they complicate any attempt to de-escalate, because now you're not dealing with a single chain of command. You're dealing with multiple overlapping chains, each with its own logic. And that creates a very important dynamic. Control becomes fragmented. Even if a state wants to limit escalation, its proxies may interpret the situation differently. They may act independently. They may respond to local pressures, or they may feel compelled to escalate in order to demonstrate strength or maintain credibility within their own networks. This introduces a level of unpredictability that is extremely difficult to manage. At the same time, asymmetric warfare changes the nature of engagement itself. Instead of large-scale, direct confrontations, you begin to see a shift toward tactics that are designed to maximize impact while minimizing exposure. That can include missile strikes, drone attacks, cyber operations, and targeted sabotage. These tools are effective because they operate below the threshold of full-scale war. They allow actors to apply pressure without necessarily triggering a proportional response. But in a full escalation scenario, that threshold becomes less clear. And once that clarity is lost, the likelihood of miscalculation increases dramatically. There is also a psychological dimension here that is often overlooked. Asymmetric warfare creates an environment of constant uncertainty. You don't always know where the next attack will come from. You don't always know who is responsible. And you don't always know what the intended message is. That uncertainty has a profound impact on decision-making. Because in high-pressure environments, uncertainty tends to produce two competing instincts, caution and escalation. Some actors may respond cautiously, trying to avoid further escalation. Others may respond more aggressively, seeking to deter future attacks by demonstrating strength. And when those responses interact, they can create a cycle that reinforces instability rather than reducing it. This is where the system becomes particularly dangerous, because asymmetric warfare doesn't require parity to be effective. In fact, it often thrives on imbalance. A relatively small actor can impose significant costs on a much larger one by exploiting vulnerabilities, leveraging surprise, and operating within environments that are difficult to control. And that asymmetry has real strategic implications. It means that even if one side has overwhelming conventional superiority, it cannot simply rely on that advantage to resolve the conflict. It must also account for the decentralized, adaptive nature of its opponents. And that requires a different kind of strategy, one that is as much about intelligence and perception as it is about force. But here's the deeper insight. Asymmetric warfare doesn't just change how conflicts are fought, it changes how conflicts are experienced. For those on the ground, it creates a sense of constant pressure. For decision makers, it creates a sense of limited control. And for observers, it creates a sense of unpredictability that makes it difficult to see where the conflict is headed. That combination, pressure, complexity, and uncertainty, is what makes asymmetric warfare so difficult to contain once it begins to accelerate. Right? And when you layer that onto a broader regional conflict with multiple actors and multiple fronts, the result is a system that becomes increasingly difficult to stabilize, because every action generates a reaction. Every reaction generates a counter-reaction. And in that cycle, the space for de-escalation begins to shrink. So when we talk about proxy networks and asymmetric warfare, we are not just talking about tactics. We are talking about a structural feature of modern conflict, a feature that allows wars to expand without formal declarations, a feature that allows actors to influence outcomes without direct engagement, and a feature that makes escalation harder to stop once it begins. And that leads us to the central question. In a conflict defined by networks, ambiguity, and asymmetry, how do you regain control when control itself has become the most difficult thing to define? When conflicts escalate in the Middle East, one of the first assumptions people make is that the consequences will be contained within the region. But in reality, that assumption is increasingly outdated. Because in today's interconnected world, a regional war is rarely just a regional event. It becomes a global shock, and that shock begins with energy. The Middle East remains one of the most critical energy-producing regions in the world. It is deeply integrated into global oil and gas markets, and it sits near some of the most important shipping routes on the planet. So, when conflict intensifies, the first place the world feels it is often in energy prices. Now, energy prices are not just numbers on a chart. They are a reflection of expectations. They signal confidence or the lack of it in the stability of supply. And when conflict raises doubts about that stability, markets react quickly, sometimes immediately. Higher energy prices ripple through the global economy. They increase the cost of transportation. They raise production costs for industries. They feed into inflation, and they affect everything from food prices to manufacturing to consumer goods. So what begins as a localized conflict can very quickly become a global economic issue. But energy is only one part of the equation. The Middle East is also home to critical maritime choke points, narrow passages through which a significant portion of global trade flows. These are not just geographic features. They are strategic assets, because whoever can influence these routes has the ability to affect the flow of global commerce. In a worst-case scenario, if these shipping lanes are disrupted, even temporarily, the effects can be immediate and far-reaching. Shipping costs rise, supply chains are delayed, goods become more expensive and less predictable, and global markets begin to price in risk. This is where the economic dimension intersects with psychology, because markets are not just responding to actual disruptions, they are responding to perceived risks. And in conflict scenarios, perception can move faster than reality. The anticipation of disruption can sometimes have as much impact as the disruption itself. That means confidence becomes a kind of currency. And when confidence erodes, capital becomes more cautious, investment slows, companies delay decisions, governments reassess strategies, and over time, that caution can translate into slower growth, both regionally and globally. Now, if we step back, we can see how these effects compound. A regional conflict increases energy prices. Higher energy prices contribute to inflation. Inflation puts pressure on central banks. Central banks respond by adjusting interest rates. And those adjustments influence borrowing, spending, and investment across the global economy. So a conflict that begins in one region can influence financial conditions across multiple continents. But there is also a geopolitical dimension to this, because when global economic stability is threatened, major powers take notice, not just because of direct interest, but because of systemic risk. And when systemic risk rises, the incentives for involvement change. Some actors may seek to stabilize the situation using diplomacy or economic pressure, right? Others may try to take advantage of the instability to advance their own positions, and still others may find themselves drawn in even if they initially preferred to stay out. This creates a widening circle of involvement, and as that circle expands, so does the complexity of the conflict. Because now, you are not just dealing with regional actors, you are dealing with global actors, each with their own priorities, alliances, and constraints, and coordinating among those actors becomes increasingly difficult. At the same time, financial markets are reacting in real time. Stocks fluctuate, currencies shift, capital flows adjust, and risk assessments are updated continuously. That creates a feedback loop between geopolitical events and economic responses. Each influences the other, often in ways that are difficult to fully predict. And here's where the deeper philosophical point comes in. In a globalized system, no major conflict exists in isolation. Everything is connected. And that means every major shock has the potential to cascade, but cascading systems have a particular vulnerability. They can move from stability to instability very quickly, because once confidence is shaken, the system doesn't just adjust, it recalibrates. And that recalibration can lead to new patterns of behavior that persist long after the initial shock has passed. So even if a conflict is eventually contained, the effects can linger. Energy markets may remain volatile. Supply chains may be restructured. Alliances may shift. And economic policies may be adjusted in response to lessons learned during the crisis. That's the long tail of geopolitical conflict, and it's often where the most significant changes occur, because the immediate impact of a conflict gets attention. But the long-term consequences quietly reshape the global landscape. So when we think about a worst-case scenario in the Middle East, we're not just thinking about battles or borders. We're thinking about a system under stress, a system where energy, economics, and geopolitics are all interconnected, a system where instability in one area can quickly become instability in many, and a system where the consequences of conflict extend far beyond the region where it begins. And that leads us to the central question. In a world where everything is connected, how do you contain a conflict that is designed by its very nature to spread? When we think about the worst case scenario of a full Middle East war, it's easy to focus on the immediate military engagements, regional escalation, economic shocks. But the most profound and lasting consequences often emerge after the initial crisis phase begins to stabilize. And that's where we arrive at something even more complex: humanitarian collapse, political destabilization, and long-term geopolitical realignment. Because wars don't just end with ceasefires. They end with consequences that reshape societies for years, sometimes decades. Let's start with the human dimension, because that's where the impact is most immediate and most visible. In a large-scale regional conflict, civilian populations bear the heaviest burden. Displacement becomes widespread. Entire communities are forced to leave their homes, often with little warning and limited resources. And infrastructure, hospitals, schools, water systems can be damaged or destroyed. And as basic systems break down, humanitarian needs grow exponentially. This creates what we call a displacement crisis. But that term can feel abstract. What it really means is millions of people on the move, seeking safety, stability, and basic necessities. Neighboring countries often absorb much of this pressure, which can strain their own systems economically, politically, and socially. And here's where the psychological impact becomes important, because displacement is not just physical, it is deeply emotional. It disrupts identity, community, and a sense of belonging. For those affected, the uncertainty of not knowing when or if they can return home creates a constant state of stress, and when that experience is widespread, it reshapes the social fabric of entire populations. At the same time, host countries face their own challenges. Managing large inflows of refugees requires resources, coordination, and political will. And while many countries and communities act with compassion, over time, the strain can lead to political tensions, debates over resources, and shifts in public sentiment. That's where domestic politics begins to intersect with humanitarian realities, because large-scale displacement doesn't just affect those who are displaced, it affects the countries that receive them. And in turn, it influences political discourse, policy decisions, and even electoral outcomes. But the effects don't stop there. Within countries directly involved in the conflict, prolonged instability can weaken institutions. Governments may face internal pressure. Economic activity may slow. And public confidence in leadership can be tested. In some cases, this can lead to political fragmentation, where different groups begin to pursue different visions for the future of the country. And when institutions weaken, space opens up for new actors, new alliances, and new power structures. And this is where the geopolitical dimension becomes particularly important, because a full-scale regional war doesn't just disrupt the present, it reshapes the future. It creates opportunities for some actors to expand their influence, while others may see their position weaken. Over time, this can lead to a realignment of power in the region. New alliances may form, existing ones may be tested, and the balance of influence can shift in ways that are difficult to reverse. But here's the deeper insight: these shifts don't happen overnight. They unfold gradually, sometimes quietly, often unpredictably. And they tend to persist long after the initial conflict has ended. Because geopolitical realignments are not just about military strength, they are about trust, perception, and long-term relationships. They are about which actors are seen as reliable, which are seen as vulnerable, and which are seen as dominant. And once those perceptions take hold, they can shape the structure of the international system for years to come. There is also a broader philosophical dimension to this, because in a full-scale war, the idea of order itself comes under pressure. The rules that govern international behavior, diplomatic norms, legal frameworks, established conventions, can be strained or, in some cases, overridden by the urgency of conflict. And when that happens, it raises a fundamental question: what replaces order when it breaks down? Sometimes new structures emerge. Sometimes existing systems adapt. But in many cases, there is a period of uncertainty, a kind of geopolitical in-between state where the future is not yet defined, and that uncertainty has real consequences. Because in that space, actors must make decisions without clear guarantees about outcomes. They must navigate risk without full visibility, and they must operate in an environment where the rules are evolving, sometimes in real time. That is not a comfortable position for any decision maker. And yet, it is increasingly the reality of modern geopolitics. So when we talk about long-term consequences, we are really talking about transformation. A full-scale conflict doesn't just create damage, it creates change. It accelerates shifts that may have already been underway. It reveals underlying tensions, and it forces the system to adapt, often in ways that were not anticipated. But transformation is not neutral. It can lead to greater stability or greater fragmentation. It can strengthen institutions or weaken them. It can bring actors closer together or push them further apart. And the direction it takes often depends on how the conflict is managed, resolved, and remembered. Because memory plays a role here as well. Societies remember conflict. They remember loss. They remember alliances and betrayals. And those memories shape future behavior. They influence trust. They inform policy. And they contribute to the narratives that guide national identity. So in the aftermath of a full-scale war, you don't just have a changed geopolitical map. You have a changed psychological landscape. And that is perhaps the most important and the most enduring consequence of all. Because in the end, the question is not just what happens during the conflict. The question is what kind of world is left after it ends and how that world chooses to move forward.